All right. So, technical difficulties aside, we are up, we are running, we are live on Mixer, and obviously live here in Malvern. So thank you everybody for joining again. This is the Philly Azure April meeting. Ta-da! You don't have to move the camera, Rich. I'll try to stay where it's at. So it's the normal agenda, announcements, which encompasses many things, and then we will have Rob do a session on Intro to Azure Service Fabric, and then I will talk Azure CDN. So if you are here, please stay for both, and if you're on Mixer, please stay for both sessions, and also tell all your friends. First up, announcements. I got a good amount this month, so everybody be ready for that. Last month I had one announcement, and it was check out the Azure blog, which is still true. Do that; it's awesome. However, this month, a number of announcements. First, Azure News. That URL. Click it, go to it, check it out. I'm actually going to walk through what's there briefly. That is a link to an article that Microsoft published. It's got a long name, which is Protecting Highly Confidential Sales Data with Azure SQL Database. What it really is that I liked, it is basically a walkthrough and case study of how Azure patterns can progress from simple to complicated. I'm going to walk you through that in a couple minutes, and then you will see why you would then want to go. You can read the whole article online, you can download it in Word or PDF for future reference, but it is exactly the kind of thing that you will do as somebody who works with Azure. It is the exact same evolution of thought process of how you get from where you start to where you end when you're implementing different Azure solutions. So I like it a lot. I want to tell everybody about it. I also have this, I think I tweeted this. I think it's published on LinkedIn, where I talked about it as well. So please check it out. I've got a slide on our upcoming events. There's a number coming up. Our next monthly meeting is May 14th. It is a Monday, so normally we meet on Tuesdays. That is a Monday because that Tuesday is primary election night here in Pennsylvania. So please don't forget to vote, but also don't forget to come to us the night before. Is there anyone in the room? So I'm going to look around, and also on the internet, raise your hand. Are you looking to hire somebody to do Azure work? 1, 2, that's our sponsor, Liquid Hub, and this gentleman here. There you go. He's also looking. Hit him up, I'd say, in between sessions or afterwards. All right, are you, anybody in the room, are you looking to get a job? Raise your hand and find them out. We got one. All right, if you're shy, just hit them up afterwards, ask for a card, whatever you got to do. We want to say thank you to our sponsor, Liquid Hub, and then we'll talk about our speakers tonight. Like I said, a couple more minutes. Rob, I got a couple things to go through. As a part of the announcements, there is a bunch of things coming up in the Philly-Malvern area. And Philly being a generous term here. On April 19th, it's a Thursday at the Bucksmont Technology Meetup. I will be speaking, so there's that. So feel free to check them out. They're up in Bucks County, but it's right on the line by Montgomery County. It's north of Hatfield area. So if you're from there, I'm there. I'm doing that's out there. Touche, sir. It's out there. Yeah, it's north of the city a bit. But I'll be doing my session. Part of it will be Azure CDN, which you'll see tonight. Part of it is on Service Bus. Part of it's on Azure Patterns. So check that out. Tell your friends. Azure Global Bootcamp is April 21st. That's the following Saturday after that. And that's right here. Then just announced this morning, Azure Data Fest. That is May 11th. Also here, sign up went live today as well. I definitely tweeted it and pushed it on LinkedIn, and I will be emailing the group but tonight or tomorrow, whenever I get home, with the link to sign up. So that's going out, and then obviously our next monthly meeting is May 14th. So we have all that coming up. Now, getting back to that first link I showed you and talked about, what I'm going to show here is just a screenshot of the 4 main evolution patterns that they talked about. Go to that site and check it out in depth. But I really like what they've got, which is an example, and you can see the link down here as well, of Azure pattern evolution. So This is a basic thing that you would want to do in business and in tech. I want to have a mobile app with a REST API and some back-end Azure storage, right? This is a very simple pattern. This is something I am sure all of us will be asked to do at some point, and you have probably done on-prem already in your career. If not, this is a very, very common use case that you will probably have to do and that we as technologists do all the time. So, first time they come to you, they say, I need a mobile app, and probably a web API. Well, the business will probably just come to you and say, we need a web app, or we need a mobile app, right? They don't even care about the back end. They say, we want a mobile app, let's do that. Great. Your first thought is probably something like this. You probably didn't even think of all of that. You probably just thought mobile app, REST API, back-end SQL. You didn't even think about it, but maybe blob, but that's probably what you thought. Next, you probably then thought, maybe I should protect this a little bit, right? I don't want to just have anybody on the internet querying through my app or a public-facing API all the way into my backend, right? So you are now going to do something. Well, first thing you're going to want to do is firewall off that database, right? You don't necessarily want to have that be immediately queryable from the REST API all the way in. So in order to do that, you could put a virtual network around and make a subnet around your API, and then you would firewall off your backend database from it. There's a lot that goes into this. I'm going to go through the high-level steps to get into this. Again, please just go check out the white paper. But that is the start of what you're going to do. The next thing you're going to think about is that might not be enough. We may need a little more security. Maybe this is really, really important data. And we're going to have a couple firewalls in place. And we're going to have some network security involved. And we are going to use, and you're going to hear this a lot in the future of this group, where I call Azure patterns you should know. The gatekeeper pattern is an Azure pattern you should know. If you don't, please go look it up. But the gatekeeper pattern essentially brokers it from the front end and then calls the back end so that you cannot call all the way through the stack to the back, right? You basically want to separate it out and allow the gatekeeper to make those calls for you and bring that data back, right? So a little more separation. And also notice your back end changes a little bit, right? You got this is the same, this is the same. One more, we changed. Because when we got to the end, we realized that at the very end of this, maybe we didn't need exactly what we had on the previous slide, which is blob, app data, and storage queue. We got to the end and realized, well, maybe we wanted app data and a storage table. Maybe we didn't need that queue after all, because a queue is more like a messaging pattern. And you said, well, I can either use Service Bus or I just didn't need messaging. Blob is the same, but maybe I needed a storage table, and I definitely needed a key vault, right? Because we are making this very secure. We are now going to use Key Vault to hold a lot of our credentials, and we are going to use Azure Active Directory in place with our gatekeeper pattern, right? So now, when the user comes in, the app has the user will auth into Azure Active Directory, the gatekeeper will go to the REST API, and that will be whitelisted to call into SQL, and that is how you're going to set it up. So again, high-level overview, but I want you to see this is a lot of what you would be doing as an Azure architect is figuring out how do I get from what I know, which is the very simple part of this, I need a web API and a mobile app and probably a database, to get to this. And this is a Microsoft recommended pattern, so they published this out. This is a recommended pattern on how to get to that point for very, very secure data. So you might not ever have to go all the way to this end, but just be aware that this is one of those patterns you should know about and what Microsoft recommends. So I wanted to point that out because I really like that setup. So check that out again. Go here. Cool. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor tonight, which is LiquidHub. Rob will be up here to talk about that in just a minute. He will talk about LiquidHub, and then he will be doing the first session of the night. So thank you to them. And that's Rob. And then this is me, and that's the end. So we're going to take 1 minute to swap over to Rob, and he will talk about LiquidHub, and then he will do the first presentation.
trick to this, just one. This is the only one I need.
Yep, just HDMI. Should pop in a second. Yep.
All right, sounds good. All right, hey guys. My name's McKenna. I'm a principal architect at Liquid Hub. Tim's already covered the announcements and the intros, so we'll skip over a couple of these slides. So we're going to talk about an introduction to Service Fabric, heavy emphasis on the intro, because there's a heck of a lot of detail to get to, and I think some of the more advanced topics probably require their own sessions. So I just wanted to at least get the conversation started, because I know in previous sessions we've talked about a variety of deployment capabilities to Azure, and Service Fabric's come up a couple times. So I'm a principal architect at Liquid Hub, MCSA for Cloud Platform. You can find me on LinkedIn. Not much of a tweeter, so I didn't bother to put that up there. If you do look for me there, don't get me confused with a former Attorney General of the state of Washington. When he was campaigning to be the governor of Washington State, I kept getting some misfired tweets with people telling me that it was great to meet me and they hope I do well in the election. I just wrote back to them and said thank you for your support. And I don't think they they didn't really respond after that. So Liquid Hub is a digital engagement company, handling anything from design to strategy to enterprise architecture. I'm working with, obviously, in the Azure and Microsoft areas. We are looking to hire. We have a digital integration platform which focuses on CI/CD accelerators. They have an extensive digital integration platform in the open source area. I'm looking, and we are looking to expand on that and do similar work with Azure, Microsoft products, Visual Studio, Team Services. So if you're interested in that kind of work or other work like React, Angular, .NET, or Java, and looking for work, or if you know of anybody that is, send them my way. All right, so what is Service Fabric? And there's a lot of words on here. Mainly a lot of this was taken from a lot of the basic overview documentation on Microsoft's site. So distributed system platform makes it easy to package, deploy, manage scalable, reliable microservices and containers. We've seen that kind of generally describing a bunch of different areas on Azure. Rich had spoke about a couple sessions ago about a lot of different container services. Service Fabric is one of those. Addresses significant challenges in developing and managing native apps, allows for developers and administrators to avoid complex infrastructure problems and focus on implementation. So what that's really referring to is the fact that you're deploying apps all the time, you're managing servers, you have infrastructure teams, and you're constantly monitoring the performance and load balancing and trying to make adjustments as your apps progress, as your environments expand, and Service Fabric handles much of that for you, and we'll kind of cover some of that detail. Tailored to create cloud-native services. It can start small, as needed, and grow massive scale with hundreds of thousands of machines. Forget what conference it was, but in demonstrating Service Fabric, I think they deployed about, to like 3,500 nodes or VMs in a couple of minutes. So that's where the massive scale comes into play. There's several differences between just deploying an API to an app service or deploying it to Service Fabric. And some of the architectural differences is that you have a one-to-one relationship between your app in the app service and a VM. In Service Fabric, the applications are kind of abstracted away from the VMs, and Service Fabric acts as that orchestrator to identify which VMs it'll be placed on, and it'll also move it around. Your deployments are actually a bit faster as well. You can have rolling deployments where if you have a cluster of 3, 5 VMs, it'll identify which is the best candidate for your application to run on at any given time, and will actually move it around if it's not being utilized and handle all of that orchestration for you. Some of the key capabilities can be deployed anywhere in Azure on-premise. So when you are working with an app service and you utilize an emulator, you're getting a simulation of what the experience is in Azure. When you are working with Service Fabric and you download the SDK, you're working with a direct copy of what's going on in Azure as well. Service Fabric itself can be deployed to an on-premise data center, and you get the same capabilities. It's obviously a different implementation. From a standpoint of you have more work to do in terms of identifying here are all the VMs that we're going to use in our cluster, but then you will get that orchestration capability by doing that, and works with either Windows or Linux. Develop scalable applications. So there's a couple of varieties of ways to deploy to Service Fabric. You have a Service Fabric programming model, which we'll slightly touch on. Containers. Everybody loves containers these days. Or any code, meaning if you have a job, if you have a application that's a little older than .NET Core, you can deploy it as a guest executable and still get some of the benefits of Service Fabric, and we'll touch on how that happens a little bit as well. Deploying different versions of the same application side by side and upgrading each version independently. So you have version 1, you have version 1.1. Why might you even do that? In some cases, something such as a multi-tenant application, and you have a couple of tenants are hitting version 1, and you want to upgrade and test that out. You could deploy, say, an API that's version 1.1, and it's living side by side with version 1, and at the same time, kind of rolling upgrades, and from a standpoint of the simultaneous versions of handling who's hitting which version at the same time. There's a cluster resource manager, so it's termed as orchestration as a service. The resource manager acts as kind of like a load balancer, where what I was describing is as Service Fabric handles what applications, say APIs, are being heavily hit, are resource intensive. It'll make sure that those are on the right VMs. If there's APIs that have gone cold because of lack of use, it'll move those around and optimize what nodes and VMs that the applications are running from to get the best possible performance. You can scale nodes. Typical examples are you start with 3, 5 nodes. If you can add them on the fly and subsequently have your applications scale out along the way as well. Monitor and diagnose application health. We'll see the Service Fabric Explorer, which will show us green and red, yellow, and it will show you not necessarily some failures, but at least from a standpoint of what the Cluster Explorer looks like, so that when you're going to be able to identify if something is down, that built-in monitor is there for you. and recovering from failures. So in a multi-node cluster, say that fifth node goes down and one of your APIs is running all of those, then it'll, whatever monitoring or alerting you have in place, it'll let you know, but it'll also take care of the fact that it'll find the next appropriate node to place it on while it takes care of that. So Service Fabric powers many Microsoft services. So when we're using Azure and we're using services from Azure, behind the scenes, it's actually running on Service Fabric. Azure SQL, Cosmos, Cortana, Power BI, Intune, Event Hubs, IoT Hubs, Dynamics 365, Skype for Business. And an example where for Azure SQL databases, say a single cluster for SQL databases comprises hundreds of machines running tens of thousands of containers that host a total of hundreds of thousands of databases. Each database is a Service Fabric stateful microservice. And we won't necessarily go too much into stateful or stateless services, but from a standpoint of, just as an example of, they're using Service Fabric to provide all of these Azure services to us. So I guess one question I should ask is has anybody used or is using Service Fabric at this point? Has anybody tried it out? Tried a little bit. Okay. Yeah, I was kind of I only started working with it a few months ago. So the typical suggestion I have is the Channel 9 Virtual Academy tutorials, the Channel 9, all of that stuff for getting up to speed on it, and just generally playing around with it. Hands-on is the best approach. Is how I learn best. We're currently using it on a project where we're building many microservices. Anybody working with microservices at this point, or some facet of microservices? A little bit. Getting there? Okay. Those that are you using containers already? Yes. One thing that I've noticed is that it seems that there's a general thought that if you're going to do microservices, that means you're doing containers. I agree and disagree to an extent. Just because you're using containers doesn't make it a microservice. Microservice is a much more business-oriented effort combined with the technology to break down monolithic applications into smaller chunks of functionality. And one definition is, at its simplest, the microservices design approach is about a decoupled federation of services with independent changes to each and agreed upon standard communication. So what does that all mean? We see this diagram here where we have monolithic approach and a microservice application approach. So that first one, that number one, so we got a monolithic app, contains domain-specific functionality and is normally divided by functional layers such as web, business, and data. Normal apps that we're used to just churning out. You scale the monolithic app by putting on multiple servers. Typical approach. Where you see in number three there, we start to break apart all of that functionality into smaller applications. And smaller pieces of your application start to stand on their own as microservice, like REST APIs, where if you think of all of the pieces of functionality you do in a monolithic app, you start chopping away into smaller subsections. The better example, I guess, is what you typically go to. I'm going to go to administration, or I'm going to purchasing, or shipping, or modules of like that in your applications start to become, while they're probably in one large code base, they start to be pulled away and managed on their own, because in a lot of times they are tied to an individual business unit, and all of the business units have all of their own different timelines, and could very well have their own development teams. And the premise here is that you start breaking that apart and you start gaining much more flexibility in your ability to work in a more agile environment. And number 4 is the microservice approach scales out to by deploying each independently, creating instances of these services across several virtual machines. And this is where now we've broken apart a monolithic application from a standpoint of something that maybe has 10 different modules. We break that into 10 microservices, and each of those has its own level of traffic, how often it might be utilized, or how resource intensive it might be, and in something like Service Fabric cluster, now it's all deployed, and now based off of utilization, it's going to be managed onto which VMs it could be distributed to. Reason kind of shifting to microservices is Service Fabric is basically a good means to that end, to incorporate in the grander architecture and business movement to utilize microservices. And one of the tools to help achieve that is Service Fabric. A little more on microservices. So Encapsulate, and again, this is all just from the Microsoft sites. If you scan through them, Encapsulates a customer business scenario. What problem are you trying to solve? Instead of one giant, well, we got this application X service. Well, application X is probably those 10 pieces of functionality, and you want to focus on one problem. Let's handle administration or shipping or purchasing or something like that, and developed by a small engineering team. So in a larger scale application or platform system, you may have developers that work across different pieces of that system, but this allows them to focus on the business entities that they're working with. Written in any programming language, consists of code, independently versioned, deployed, and scaled. Interact with other microservices over well-defined interface protocols. So unique names, remain consistent and available. And the consistency and the availability is certainly something that Service Fabric touts in terms of being able to recover from failures and make sure everything's reliably available. In terms of migrating existing applications on that same premise of taking a monolithic app all the way to the point of full microservice level and breaking it apart over time, this diagram I think is a pretty good depiction of the steps that could be taken to get to the point where you start with your monolithic app, you can lift and shift that, whether it's containerize it, guest executables, and get that deployed into Service Fabric. The original several years ago was like, well, lift and shift. All right, well, we're going to the IaaS approach, and we fire up some VMs and a database, and now we're in the cloud. We've got deployed, so it's just somebody else's data center. But now we're with more focus on containerization and microservices and API approaches. Breaking everything apart is an additional focus. So, in step 2 there, you see everything we've either containerized or set it up as guest executable and got most of our application into Service Fabric. And then we start thinking from a standpoint of, all right, any new functionality, we can start that as a new API or a new microservice. And as the new work comes in, start breaking that apart, and at the same time start planning for pulling everything apart that's in the monolithic application as upgrades become available in terms of timelines and budgets and all that fun stuff. And from a standpoint of migration, over time, you'll eventually get to the point where your full microservices and all the smaller parts are working and utilizing the full orchestration of Service Fabric. So I thought that was an interesting approach. Obviously, this is not this could take quite a bit of time to achieve. This is not an overnight lift and shift. This is a concerted effort, planning, and analyzing the parts of the system that need to be broken apart to get to that level. Because by the time you're at 5, you're in a far more flexible state of the system and able to react and share more resources, because some of these monolithic components may be sharing resources as well. And towards the end here, you've transformed into a microservices system. This is just a screenshot from the Service Fabric Explorer that I'll show. But in terms of some of the features that you'll see is that when an upgrade is in progress, you can see that the 0 and 1 are the first 2 nodes that were already upgraded. That number 2 is in progress. So you see the upgrade status of rolling forward in progress, meaning that they've gone from current version 101, trying to go to 102, and so we've upgraded node 0, node 1, 2's in progress, and all the while when traffic's coming in, it's going to the completed nodes. And this is just a different level. It's not the application level. It's 2 levels down of at the API, basically just showing the same thing. Here's a few links just to, in terms of understanding microservices, if you want to look into more of that. There was an open source announcement that Tim pointed me to, that the Service Fabric environment itself is become open source. And once you get familiar with it and there are features that you want to enhance or extend or contribute to, now you're going to be able to do that. It's from a Linux standpoint, they're already there. From the Windows standpoint, because it's so ingrained, because this kind of spawned out of internal workings of how they were building things inside of Microsoft, it's going to take them a little bit of time to fully break that apart and make that fully available, but that's in progress. Programming model, that's something we can have on a future session as well. And then the Service Fabric Cluster Resource Manager, which is what I was describing in terms of internal to Service Fabric. It's handling where to put the services based off of managing the resources. And before we get to questions, just wanted to show a few things here. There's a couple of ways, several ways to, as there are with pretty much anything in Azure, is to how to create a cluster. So in Visual Studio, and even in the last few days, I don't know if anybody's paid any close attention to this, but Visual Studio has had an update per day for like the last week, it seems. Tim's noticed? Or Tim's got a question?
We have a question from Mixer for your previous slide. This comes from Brian. It says, what is the future of Service Fabric when there is investment in ACS?
When there is an investment in ACS?
I think what he's implying is that with Azure Container Services being heavily looked into by Microsoft versus the open sourcing of Service Fabric, he's probably just wondering what your thoughts are on where Microsoft is focused. Obviously, knowing that you don't actually speak for Microsoft, neither of us do. But I think that it's a valid question of where they're going with it. Although I will say, from what I've heard of Service Fabric, Microsoft does love it and is definitely looking to that as an underlying background, underlying technology moving forward. But we'll take any of your comments on what you think of ACS for containers versus Service Fabric in certain, we'll say, microservices options.
I think it's a matter of probably environment. I think your point is valid. Microsoft is already heavily invested in it. They'll continue to be. I can't predict that. To be completely honest, have not worked much with ACS or Kubernetes. So
I think we'll ping Rich when he comes back in the room and ask him the same question. And Brian clarified. He said they're pushing ACS as well. So I think we'll ask Rich when he comes back in the room. But also I'll say, for when it comes to Azure, Microsoft usually has many redundant options for what you're trying to do. Just because you want to do microservices doesn't mean you necessarily want to do containers, and just because you want to do containers doesn't necessarily mean you're doing microservices, although they both can do that. We also have another question from Mixer, thanks to Rajiv. Which languages does Service Fabric support for REST APIs that can interact with it? If you know that off the top of your head, great. Or whatever ones you have. Otherwise, one of us will try to look that up and post it back in the chat.
So in terms of the applications that you deploy, or utilizing like the Azure REST APIs to manage Azure resources?
I think he's asking what you can use to interact with it, but I guess my answer would be any of them. If it's REST, anything that can do REST can then, if you're standing up a REST one, if it's the endpoints, it should just be any REST call. But
yeah, I mean, it's not specific. If the question is geared towards whether or not you can deploy Java APIs, you can certainly do so. So anything, it's yeah. Okay, got a thumbs up for Tim. Yeah, it's just a matter of this is another mechanism for deployment. So it's not to say that you have to write ASP.NET Core web APIs or anything like that. That's why they have guest executables, container deployments as well. But to show how we can deploy, Visual Studio was just recently updated this last week or so, and you can actually create a cluster on the fly from here, where you can. This wizard now pops up. You select your subscription, where you want the location, and name your cluster. Give the password for the certificate, and passwords for your VMs, because these VMs you're going to be able to actually log into and manage if you choose to do so, and what ports you want open as well. So I'm not going to do that because I've already built that cluster, and when we ran that. Now I don't know that it will actually create all these storage counts. I did run into some technical difficulties when I did that earlier. I think that was just user error, but it creates a virtual machine scale set, a load balancer, storage accounts, public IP, key vault for storage of the certificate that's generated, Service Fabric cluster, and all inside a virtual network. So here is the Service Fabric Explorer. Here is where you can inspect all of your applications that are deployed at varying levels, and get health information. See health state is okay right now. And all the way down to the point of seeing that this application is deployed on all three nodes and which nodes that they are deployed on. Here's more details where you can dig into the nodes itself, and you'll see which applications are deployed there. And there are system functionality in terms of cluster manager service, a DNS service, where you'll be able to name your APIs or services, and for the sake of API discoverability, so that they can communicate with each other if need be. failover, fault analysis. So that's stuff that we can take a look at in possibly a future session. But you get a lot of information. Here's where I showed earlier in terms of if an upgrade is in progress, you can watch that take place. Let's see. There's a cluster manifest. This handles things like the certificates that are involved, the ports that are available, and aside from handling everything in the manifests, when you go into the details of the cluster, obviously you're going to be able to manage things there as well. Just to show you a couple of things here real quick. So this is an API that I created from a template that's built into Visual Studio. And you go through the wizard, and just like you would create any other project, obviously, and my goal was to create a .NET Core API for Service Fabric. So you get the web API like you normally would, but then you get basically a Service Fabric specific project on top of that in the solution. And this is where the application manifests come into play. Your application parameters, publish profiles, and the script that you are able to actually deploy, modify if need be. Interesting thing about a couple of these is when I started working with Service Fabric 3-4 months ago, when I went through the Visual Studio and was creating a template, intending to create an ASP.NET Core stateless API, Wizard went through fine and worked great. But then when I went to go to just digging around and looking at the details of the project, it wasn't actually a .NET Core API. It was actually a .NET Framework 4.6. So it was a bug in Visual Studio that within a matter of weeks they had actually corrected that as well. Our team has run into a couple of items where we've tried to directly deploy a service from Visual Studio directly to Azure. There's a slight glitch where in your local cluster, that sort of is running interference at the moment. So their recommended approach is actually take down your local cluster, and then it opens the pathway. Because that's just one of the things that, like I said, the number of updates that are taking place are pretty rapid fire. .NET in general, Microsoft, Azure, everything's getting upgraded pretty quickly these days. It's no longer, waiting a couple of years for things to change. Pardon me. So this is just your basic REST API, and we can, pardon me, excuse me. We can go into some of this stuff in another session, but from the standpoint of some other things to point out is Visual Studio Team Services. In terms of builds and releases, they already have templates that if you want to create a new build. Yes, sir.
Got another one coming in online. Thanks again, Rajiv. The question is, does Service Fabric also provide any kind of interface for tracking or monitoring system alerts? Does it allow like a plugin to monitor that? And is there a single window or dashboard or something to get that shows you system health?
Yeah, the overall system health is this kind of screen where when you can have tens of however many services you have in place. Say you had 10 different APIs running and one's failing, this is where you would have that information. You can there are additional metrics available. There's additional information in terms of cluster map. We only have 3 nodes in this one, and details such as that. And there are certainly other additional monitoring capabilities that you can either enable or integrate with other monitoring capabilities that are within Azure itself. So just looking at this, there are Service Fabric templates in Visual Studio Team Services for Service Fabric applications for build and release as well. Let's see here. You also have the capability to work with your own local cluster. So you see here local host, where I can go here, I can publish to my local cluster. And we'll see how that goes. While that's thinking, another thing to consider when you're testing this out, if you would just want to focus on the programming models, the deployment of containers, guest executables, and trying that out from the application level, there is what they call a party cluster that is available, which you do not have to build the cluster or manage it at all. You can just go through a tutorial that I'll try to get to in a moment. That is a free cluster, and you're able to deploy to it. Obviously, though, anything you save there, once the cluster is no longer available, your work is gone there. So it's really just for testing. So we're going to let that think for a moment. And let's see here. Thought I had this up. Yeah, let's do this momentarily. Yes, sir. I'll reconnect in a moment. Yes, Tim.
Follow up to that. It was a follow up to that about metrics. The question was, you want to know specifically if any interaction via CLI for Service Fabric was also captured in the logs, metrics, dashboards, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess my follow-up question that would be, have you used the CLI for any of this, and what was your experience with it?
I haven't used the Azure CLI to deploy it yet. I've used PowerShell. That was just to try it out. But actually, Azure CLI is another avenue that I'll be working on. So I'll be happy to provide that feedback when I get to it. I just haven't had an opportunity to do that as of yet. All right, let's see. All right, so that's been published. And if we look at the local, we see here now we have one application. And we can dig into it. We got version 102, which is the latest. And again, this is just a basic API. And if we go and attempt to update it, now if we want to publish local cluster and we want to upgrade it, we're able to manage the versions here as well. Hopefully that one will take a little less time. Yeah, I'm deploying the correct. No, it's not the project, the assembly of the project. this is the Service Fabric manifest version. Oh, okay. The question was the version that I just updated. Is it the assembly version, basically? Where you would see, you know, this web API DLL version, and it's not that. It's the version of the we have the application manifest, the service manifest. Let's see if I can find out where that is. So here's where it ended up changing. Is the service manifest of the API itself. And the interesting is when you're running this locally, the selected project selected as startup is the Service Fabric project, and because of the intertwining where we see when we've gone through the templates, is you've created, you know, service instances and service endpoints, and let's see here, and registering a service type, which is the basically a collection of services that make up that service type. Let's see, well, that's still considering whether or not it wants to work or not. Here, if you go to tryservicefabric.azure.com is where you can get to the party clusters. And here you can just sign in, join either Windows or Linux cluster. And then it's got a series of instructions on downloading the certificate, running a PowerShell script to on how to connect. You know, a couple simple instructions on once you save that PFX file locally and run the PowerShell script, that'll get the certificate loaded locally, and then you'll be able to be off and running and using that party cluster, and you'll have the ability to start deploying and testing it out. So let's see here. That was published. So let's see here. So that did work. I was hoping to be able to, grew a little too impatient there. I was hoping to be able to see it in progress here. But from a standpoint of just kind of showing that you can deploy from Visual Studio directly to your cluster in Azure or to a local cluster. So there's a lot of Visual Studio tooling that makes it easy even to create clusters. And you can create clusters all the traditional Azure ways through the Azure CLI, REST API, ARM templates, or obviously directly through the portal. So that's about it. Just wanted to, at least from a standpoint of these sessions, get some information out there. And you know, if you guys have any questions, I'll try my best to field them. But like I said, I'm new to this, is a little less new than I guess to others, but I'm still new to it as well. Anybody have any questions? Like Microsoft Office? Mm-hmm. I don't know that this would be the right mechanism for Microsoft Office to interact with something. Is it something where it needs to call an API, or because you can remote into the VMs, but I don't know that you would do that in the nature that you're referring to.
they use on all their brochures right there. So I need that get to that.
So the question is can you get to the underlying VMs when you're running Service Fabric? Yes, but I agree with Rob. I don't think I don't think that's how you would approach this. If you needed fonts, you would probably be running your website on top of Service Fabric, and then you would load the fonts file from that level of your application. You wouldn't think of loading it locally. You would think of loading it at your web app level. So you would either do it. I don't even think you would go there. I think you would think above that. Think of this as a complete PaaS and SaaS solution. If you have a fonts file, do it when you publish your website out. Publish that file out.
But are you using those fonts into generating some document? Yeah. See, that's where. Well, that's where I think if you start going into some of the patterns that Tim was showing on the screen earlier in terms of, the service bus eventing of you have a request to create a document, so that goes on a queue, and now some web job picks it up and says, all right, I got to create a document, but then there's some process that's where the font stuff is in terms of creating your customized document. So in terms of how we might have done it, what might be considered legacy way now on-prem, and we have all these crazy, well, I want my Excel file to call this database directly, or I want Word to this Microsoft Word template to get all this data or stuff like that. I think that's.
It's not really that. Word doc. And I need Word.
Right. See, in terms of converting stuff to a PDF, you wouldn't, sometimes these days you wouldn't even bother to write that yourself. There's a service somewhere that cloud service you could do that, or if you have limitations where you're told you have to write that code, then you're creating it as a service. But you might not necessarily be using Service Fabric for that capacity, where you might be using it where it has a REST API where it accepts the inputs for it, and then puts a record on a queue for some other.
Back there has to be.
In terms of the volume of requests for creating documents, yeah, sure, absolutely, yeah, and that's where if you have tons of requests coming in, that's where Service Fabric would say, all right, there's the API that's receiving those requests that's going to go do something in the background, would auto scale and create more capacity to accept those requests, and then you got all the other stuff on the back end behind all of that where it's putting information on queues, and the queues are scaling, the jobs are scaling. Yeah, in terms of, I don't have a good handle on exactly why you would dive in and remote into those VMs. The capability is there. If you have something that you need that would help the service run, then you could do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also struggling to think of why. I'm sure there's good reason why you'd remote in, but to Rob's point about the way you design stuff in Azure is just different than the way you on-prem. You would stand up your server. You'd probably have a SQL server, and then on that, the server that's your web front end. It would also be your web API, and like we would have done, a while ago, we would have installed things on it in order to do the conversion, and it would have served it. But here. Okay, so I would say in this scenario, you would use this for the site, and you would farm off that to other servers, and it gives you an opportunity to try to save money, and when you re-architect this in Azure. So if you're looking to move all this up, maybe you don't need servers to handle peak load. Maybe you want to implement service bus in between to level out your load. Maybe you want to use Azure Functions and another service that only has to come online to do your conversions or spin up those documents as needed, rather than having it sit there all the time waiting for requests. So it gives you an opportunity to look at your patterns, stretch it out, and probably save money going to Azure.
Anybody else? Yep. All right, then Tim, you're back up.
All right, thanks.
In terms of
So just, competitors, if you know of a service that's similar, I'm sure that's similar to right?
yeah, I mean, we were talking about the question about in case anybody else online didn't hear it, it was services that are similar to Service Fabric. I'm not aware. I mean, Rich gave the talk on containers, so there's other ways to do deployments. This is one of the many, as Tim pointed out. There's similarities, but this is one that they had built internally and are using and exposing, and is yet another option for deployments.
Test, test. Can you hear me, Chris? Yep. As always, when we publish these out, we also put the links in for all of the. We have links that go to pages that have a collection of all the links that are shared in the chat and during the presentations. So those are usually posted when we post to YouTube. It usually has a link to all the links from the presentation. And I think we sometimes have posted those back to the Meetup site, but we can do that if that's something people want as well. All right. Just another minute here. I'm going to try to do something crazy and use all three monitors that I have up here. See if I can have my presentation and my view of it and Mixer. Give me a second while I try that. And as I get the mouse back on my screen. Okay. All right, that's going to be weird because there's a 10-second delay, but I think I can do it. So we have that. We have questions. So if you do have questions coming in, I have the feed up so I can see it. There are either separate products. Got it. All right, and Chris, you're controlling the Philly Azure one, so that's good. All right. Cool. All right. Thank you once again to Rob for the presentation and to Liquid Hub for sponsoring. Again, the food. It was awesome. Thanks all for who are joined online via Mixer. We are going to kick off the second presentation of the night. This is going to be on Azure CDN. So I'm going to talk an overview of it and talk some real specific things about it. I don't want to, I'll assume some base level knowledge of CDN, but I will go over how that does work for those of you so we're all kind of on the same page. And then I'm going to dive into a lot of the different things that are involved in it. So, oops. Once more. One more time. I swear this was working earlier. Interesting. It doesn't work if I have a web browser up in front of it. All right, so I can't see the Mixer feed. So just Chris, just wave if there's a question, and mic up. All right. So I'll give an overview of CDN. I assume a lot of you know basics of it, but we'll dive into what that really is. I'm going to talk features, tiers, a little bit of pricing. I'm not going to give you actual prices, but I will talk about the pricing of it, optimizations, challenges, and then security. So overview first, and I got to stand kind of over here so A, I'm on the thing, and B, so I can actually see this. So at a high level, what is a CDN in general, right? Forget that this is Azure. What is a CDN? A CDN is again, stands for Content Delivery Network, but it basically just caches static content on different places around the world so that when people visit your website, it gets to them quicker, right? That's the problem we're solving. The problem we're solving is you have stuff, people want to get to it on your website, you want it closer to them, right? You don't want to have, if you can help it, you don't want to have all of your website being served out of the same server in one part of the planet, because what you're trying to beat is the speed of light. That is essentially what this is for. Speed of light still takes time to go through fiber optic networks all around the planet. There's going to be lag, right? It is unavoidable. There will be lag. You want to try to limit that. So if you have CDN servers all over planet Earth, then when your customers or users come to your website, they will get the static content much quicker. This is traditionally used for caching static content. We will talk about dynamic content later, but for starters, we're talking static content. We mean web pages that don't change. We mean blob items, so videos, things like that. Large items that you want to serve to your clients or users quickly as possible. And the code for your site, right? If you have CSS and JavaScript and pictures, all of that you want to cache closer to your users. This is a public thing. So we will talk about security later, but at a high level, this is probably public stuff. You are probably running a public website, or you are trying to get this out to your users, and so it is probably going to be public. I'll read you the statement about security access later when we get to it. But essentially, you want to get it to them, and you want to get it to them fast. There's a basic overview photo here of how it works. The first user, named Alice, is trying to get to your website, and your website is served out of this origin. The first person through has to go all the way to the origin, get the data, and have it sent back. Everybody else gets it from the edge servers. So that is the basics of how a CDN works. That is going to get cached on your point of presence server. So POP, which is traditionally associated with email, we're now going to say POP for the rest of this. And you'll have to remember it stands for more than one thing. But your POP server is your edge server, and that's where it's going to serve it up from here on out. So, let's see. And it says it right here. So all of the stuff that I have, the links are on the bottom. So if you're checking out this presentation, I'll post it. I forgot to post it in advance, but I will post it. You can go get it. All of the links for every page are there, and then they're also at the very end. Using a CDN, you can cache publicly available objects loaded from either blob storage or web apps or virtual machines or a folder or another location. I'll go through all the locations in a little bit, but there's a lot of locations. And you basically want to put them in strategic locations worldwide for, again, delivering static content. And it could be, you can also, so the last sentence is something I'm going to talk about in a little bit, you can also use it as a cache for dynamic content, but we'll talk about how to do that later. So it's a newer feature of Azure CDN, but for a while we're going to start with just the static stuff. This is basically the same photo that I just showed you. A little bit more of a technical diagram on it, but essentially you've got clients coming in, it's 120 milliseconds to the origin, and you're bringing over an image file, which is a certain size, probably a couple megs, because we don't compress things anymore. But everybody else, it would be far easier for them to go on the 40 millisecond lag to a CDN and go grab that. And maybe it's compressed out there as well. You can do a number of cool things with your CDN. It's not just taking it and putting it closer to your people. There is a bunch of other things that we're going to talk about when it comes to CDNs as well. But this is the basic diagram that you would check out to figure out, okay, high level overview, this is what I want to do. I said that because that is the basic overview of CDN, and now we can start talking about all the cool features and everything else I actually want to dive into tonight, but I just wanted to level set on CDN stuff. First, what are the features? There are a number of slides here that I'm going to show that talk about features. This is the first, but also the first thing you're going to notice, there are 3 different versions. You're going to hear me say this a lot for the rest of the presentation. You need to know what you actually want to do with your CDN. It's not enough for you to know, I want to use a CDN. Which one of these 3 versions depends on what you actually want to do, because they all do different things. It is not this slide, the rest of them aren't like it. In this one, you can basically go, oh, I can either choose the standard versions, and they're both exactly the same, or I can get the premium. It doesn't work like that on all the other slides. So what you want to do will depend on which one you have to pick. Also, what region you're deploying your CDN to makes a difference. These are the ones that are available in most places on planet Earth, however, not everywhere. And certain regions of the Earth have other carriers. So you need to be aware of which carriers are available in the regions that you want to target. For this one though, again, you're going to see premium from Verizon. It's basically Akamai versus Verizon. And here you'll just see, I don't have to read the slide to you. You can kind of see the differences on here. But as I start going through these, then you'll start to see what I'm talking about. These are all some of the differences. And so now what you want to do depends, because if you want to do dynamic site acceleration with prefetch or compression, I'll get into this later, you need Akamai. You can't get it on Verizon and you can't get it on premium. Or if you need video streaming optimization, you need Akamai. However, these stars right here actually mean that they do that natively out of the box, where it's a specific thing that you would choose if you do Akamai. I'll get to that in a little bit. But the point is you have to know what you want to do, because if you need this, it only does it in here. Or for some reason, caching rules is only available in the standard, but not in the premium, for whatever reason, right? You have to know what you want to do, and then you have to choose which version of it. So for everybody here, if you're using a cache in US, these are going to be your options. You have to pick the right one. There are more features that we want to look at, whether it's diagnostics or stats or reports or this or that. Again, I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. You can kind of see what we got going on here. And this is all straight off the Azure site. Always, always, always consult the website, right? Don't take whatever I say as my word. I pulled it off the website. You should go to the website, because it's always being updated, whether it comes to features or general availability or pricing, whatever it is, always just go to the website every single time you need to know that. Lastly, pricing details. You'll see a nice picture like this when you go to the pricing details page. Gives you a high-level overview of what the differences are, but again, be real specific. Dive in. Know which features you need, know what regions they need to be in, and then cross-check that table. You're going to do this a lot. I could be giving this exact same presentation for any Azure service, and it's going to be the same spiel, which is know the features you need, know where the service has to be located, and cross-reference those tables. And then cross-check that with pricing, because they're all going to be that. On a side note, if you are actually going A, through all of this, and B, are actually pricing it out, there is a very nice pricing tool for Azure, which you can go in and start adding your services and choosing your regions, and it adds it all up for you in a nice long spreadsheet that you can actually export out and then use as you need. So I went through that the other day. That's actually a really nice tool for figuring out how much does stuff cost. Because the pricing models can be a little more complicated. And as going way back to about an hour and 20 minutes ago, when I showed you that Azure pattern evolution, that was really cool. But now your pricing model has to update. Every time you go through one of those evolutionary things, you have to go back up and make sure you have all of those things in your original pricing estimate. So be aware of that as well. All right, now you would use Azure CDN not just for the obvious, which is caching your static data closer to your users. There are a number of optimization scenarios that you can encounter. So it could be a website or a live stream or a video or a large file download. You can also have, like I said, the dynamic stuff, but this is what you're going to see. So This is what you see when you come in. These are the options. If you choose Akamai, I just chose that as an example, but I also chose it because it has all of the options listed. For Verizon, it doesn't have some of these options listed because it does it automatically. So that goes back to that slide from like 3 slides ago where there were the asterisks on it and it said it does that magically. But if you choose Akamai, you have to pick which scenario you want. You don't have to, but this is the ones you get to choose from. So read up on all of them and decide again. Not only do you have to know which features you need from that previous list, but you need to know which one of these you're going to do. Is it general web delivery, or we can do streaming, or video on demand streaming, which those are two are not the same thing. Large file download, or DSA, dynamic site acceleration. Super cool stuff. I'll get to that in a minute. Oh, you see right here. Note, the Azure CDN for Verizon supports general web delivery. It can be used for video and stuff, but you don't have to select it. I pointed that out earlier. It looks something like this. When you go in then, after you choose your optimization, you then have to choose your source, right? So you said, okay, I want CDN. I know who I want. And now I need to know where am I pointing it at, right? Because it's not just a website. You can point it at storage or another cloud service, or you can point it at your web app in Azure, or you can point it to a custom origin, right? You can point it to pretty much anything, right? Custom origin covers a lot, right? Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, we have a question from Mixer. The question is, how does Azure CDN handle private keys in TLS HTTPS? And then the follow-up to that is, are there HSM options?
Got it. I will talk Azure security in a little bit. So thank you for the question. You can hold on to the end. I will get to all of the security things in a few slides. So, and I will follow up on that. Cool. Besides the options that we just looked at, there's another option for optimization, and that is dynamic site acceleration. It's available from Akamai and Verizon, although some things are only available in Akamai depending on which part of DSA you want to use. It has a number of things. So let me back up. What is DSA really? So we've been talking about caching static content because that's what a traditional CDN is. But what if you have dynamic content? What if we're talking Twitter and the home screen where tweets are just always coming in? That's dynamic. There's nothing inherent to that you would then push out and cache besides the avatars, right? Or if we're talking your Facebook feed, it's always being updated with data. So that's not something you can just farm out and cache relatively easily because it's dynamic. So what can we do to help with that? And that's what DSA is for. Also, side note, dynamic site acceleration is available as a CDN, but it's actually a different pricing model. So if you are architecting a CDN solution, you are probably choosing 2 CDNs for it. You are choosing one for your static content, and then if you need dynamic content, you would choose DSA. It is a separate pricing model and a separate option. But it can basically, is this on the next slide? There it is, okay. So the next slide will show you this. Basically, it's a dynamic way to optimize it. It can use route and network optimization, TCP optimization. It can do prefetching. It can do adaptive image compression. It can do a number of different things. I should probably change this so I show this image first. I like this image. This explains exactly what DSA is going to do for you. You have your user, and they're coming in. And those purple ones are Microsoft Azure. They're like POP servers or other servers that are available for DSA. And your user wants something that is not cached through CDN. They want something that's dynamic to get to your website. And in this scenario, going over the general internet, it's currently a 200 millisecond lag. But if they were to go through another POP server and get routed in, it's only a 125 millisecond lag. So if this is something you want for your users, you can have them get routed to your origin faster. And so when you set this up, when you set DSA up, you then point it to your origin and say, this is where I want. And then Azure, DSA figures out the quickest route to get to your data from all of these different places while your users are coming in. So again, you're going to pay for it because you are routing them not through the open internet to get there. But if you want to speed up your site and it's something you want to pay for, you can use this to route this to your servers faster for the non-cacheable data. It does a number of different things, and you'll see in parentheses what is Akamai only versus what is available from everything. First is the route optimization, right? That's the first thing. That's what I just showed you in that last picture. That's the cool part. That's the crux of it. There are other things. It can do TCP optimizations, right? So it can eliminate slow start. It can use persistent connections. So it can kind of mess with some of the underlying networking to get your users there, continually have connections open, route them there faster. It can do prefetch, right? So this is, at a high level, it's the opposite of lazy loading. If anyone's familiar with that term when it comes to code, you would lazy load stuff on your website that you're not sure your users are going to get, and then it would only get it for them if they encountered that part of your code. That's lazy loading, which you do for optimization reasons. This is the opposite. This is go get it all. Go get it all quickly and give it to them. Because their pipe is wide enough, they can go get that data quickly. Just go get it and preload it, right? Go get it in advance, fetch it, and give it to them as quick as you can. That's the point of this site. You are willing to pay for the optimizations and the bandwidth to get everything to them as quick as they can to optimize their experience. Adaptive image compression. So basically, this leverages standard JPEG compression to automatically do that and send it over the wire as well. So image compression is something a lot of us just do for our websites, and we used to write code to say if they're on a slower connection, send them this compressed version, or they're on a high speed, send them the full version, right? Whatever it might be. This does it automatically for you, where you just say, these are my JPEGs, send it correctly, pick the version based on their speed, and send it over. So it's a quick overview of DSA. Challenges. So now that we are past all of the cool part, and I'm sure I've convinced all of you that you should be using this, we're going to talk about some of the things that are not the easiest. These are things that everyone does. These are not inherent to Azure CDN. These are inherent to every CDN you would ever consider doing ever. No matter what the vendor is, you are going to run into these problems. Everyone runs into these problems. Best to learn about them right away and get on that as soon as possible. Look up how you want to deal with these, right? What's your origin going to be? Where are you going to get it from? Do you need an alternate location? Is it going to be a single point of failure or not? Are you going to have more than one for that? How do you do versioning and cache control? This one trips up everybody. Have a plan. How are you going to do versioning for the stuff you're pushing out, especially if we're talking code, JavaScript or CSS, things that have to match up and be the same when they get there. How are you going to do cache invalidation? How are you going to handle this? How are you going to handle testing, right? Go through that process, figure it out in advance, and have your plan up and running. You don't want to be learning that as you're going through your first deployment. Practice that and have that out of the way, because everybody in the entire process of getting this out the door is going to run into a cache issue, right? And that's what I was just talking about, testing. Also, SEO. If that is something that really matters to you, you have to understand how SEO is affected by using a CDN. So if that affects you, look that up. I'm not an expert in that by any means, but you can see right here why that would be an issue. And lastly, I talked about this already, the single point of failure or not, right? What is the resilience of this? This is why you would want to do this with Azure. This is why rolling your own CDN worldwide is tough. You're going to want something that has SLAs and uptime and options. There's a bunch of POP servers in Azure. I don't even put them here. There's so many. Click on the list of POP servers and go there and look them up. That's what your list is going to be that you can choose from when you do this. So there are more challenges. Now we're going to talk security. Because the first thing I have to say is what it says directly on the website, which is many CDN services, such as Azure CDN, do not currently offer any type of access control for the content. Okay? This is supposed to be public. You are putting this out there for everybody. You are not having individual login access to a global CDN. That is not what it is currently designed to do. Having said that, we've got options. Also, before I get to those options, clients may have issues accessing it. Some clients have it so that they cannot access different cloud services from their work, or different CDN locations. Or maybe the internet is down. The internet is down in air quotes between wherever they are and your CDN. But maybe it's not down between them and your website. How would that affect your JavaScript? How would that affect your CSS? How would your website work or function if you were only reliant on that? So keep that in mind. If users are blocked out, that could be an underlying issue. Let's talk security. The first thing, you can use SSL, right? You don't have to, but let's all just agree to use HTTPS, and I can go on to the next bullet point, but you can use HTTPS for this. You will also run into CORS issues, right? So know where they're going, know where you're trying to call them, set up CORS correctly, and you will be fine. But just be aware that you're going to run into that issue. Now, the actual security stuff. HTTPS across all of them. Custom domain with HTTPS, only with Verizon. All of them offer geofiltering. Token auth, only on Verizon Premium. So if you need token auth for your CDNs, that's your only option. Because that is what you're going to use or consider using when talking authorization to your Azure CDN. So there's a lot of stuff up here. I'm going to kind of go over the high level, which is it's not full security. It is not username and password against the CDN. That is not what this does. This is, though, to limit access when you need via a number of different mechanisms, and I'll get to them on the next page. But the first thing it does is prevent hot linking, which I think we all may have learned about a while ago. It was a thing where people would just take the URL to your image and put it on their website, and then you would get charged for that usage. This prevents that. So this is one of the underlying reasons why you would use CDN, to prevent hot linking. It seems to be less of an issue now, but on dial-up, that was a really big issue. Right? For those of us who remember what dial-up was, hot linking was stealing other people's bandwidth, and it was really expensive back in the day. So that was one of the first things that you would try to conquer with that. Now, you want to have token auth if you want to limit this. Again, it should be public, but if it's not going to be public, here are your options for limiting via token authentication. You can limit by country, or URL, or host, refer, IP address, protocol, or just a general expiration time. So you can tweak these to get very specific on who can actually access the items stored in CDN. Because again, it's not a single username and password, but you can see here, by combining some of these, you can be pretty specific on what group of users you want to have access to what's in your CDN and who's not going to get access. And this is how it's going to work. Now again, this is token auth. So you would basically, let me back up so I can see this. I have two diagrams. I can never remember which one goes into which. Okay. This one is how the token auth works, which is the client's going to log in to your web app. It's going to get the URL for where it's going to get the access token. It's going to go to the CDN endpoint. It's going to validate it. And then, let's see, no, I'm confusing that with this one. They go to the CDN endpoint. They attempt to decrypt using the key. If they get it, it sends it back to them so they can apply the rules and then send back the data if they're allowed to. This is the one where it actually figures out, should you be allowed? So the other one is the basic, hey, do I get it or not? No? Okay, 403 access denied. Otherwise, yes. This is the one where we go, okay, how do I figure out, does this person get it? And what we give them, again, is an access token. So this is token auth into the POP CDNs. If you are allowed, token will be correct. It will allow you to decrypt it, and it will send it back to you, otherwise 403. Yes? It's specific for CDN. So if it were to come out of Azure AD, yes, Chris? You are so smart. I did that. Yes. Yes, please.
So my question was the CDN token that's generated. Is it something that you have to go into CDN and say, hey, I'm creating a token that my app can use? Or is it something that can be integrated with an identity provider that if we're using something like claims-based authentication?
Yes. Great question, now that everyone on Mixer can hear it and in the room. No, you are not setting up your own claims provider. You do not have to do Azure AD because it's not required for this. You're not doing Azure AD would then imply that you could do this on an individual basis, which we already said we're not doing, but it could be for tokens. It is not. You are just going to go in, pick your CDN endpoint, tell it to use token auth. It will do all of the magic, and then you will tell it what scenarios it should, and then it does all of that. As far as I know, it does all of that in the background for you. It issues the keys and allows you to decrypt it. It handles that. It doesn't actually have to. You don't have to do any of that token stuff. So now, having said all of that, Chris, what was the original security question?
Oh, from way back.
From way back, from like
Okay.
10, 15, 20
You know,
minutes ago.
I have a related one here.
Oh, go ahead.
In CDN, can an access token be only served to an authenticated user?
My gut says no, because then that wouldn't be the way that you would consider using this. But I understand the question, and I think that the answer may be yes through. I'm thinking maybe you could do that through host or refer, because I'm thinking you could modify the headers to. I think what the question is basically asking is, can you figure out if the user is authenticated to something that you control, and then that user could then go authenticate, and that would essentially be a way to have authenticated into CDN. I want to say I think the answer is yes, but I don't know for sure, so I don't want to say that.
The question might also be just, do users have to be authenticated to take advantage of this?
No.
We'll see if there's. That's me interpreting there. We'll see if there's a follow-up. Earlier, the question was, how does Azure CDN handle private keys in TLS HTTPS? Are there HSM options?
Got it. I don't know. We will have to bing that later. Oh, okay. Welcome, and thanks for being on Mixer. Nice. Welcome. I don't know. I don't know how that works with TLS. I assume that's something that it would negotiate itself, again, because you don't have to be. This works public, so you don't have to be authenticated in any way, shape, or form.
In terms of if you're a financial services company, if you're a company that has some pretty private certificates for a domain that you have, a custom domain you bring or something like that, you treat your private keys and your certificates for TLS pretty seriously, such that they would be, I would imagine they'd be loaded into the Azure CDN tool at some point, but I'm just wondering how they'd be handled, stored on disk or stored in a hardware security module or something of that nature. I guess.
Gotcha. I think I understand the question. I think we would have to dive in more into that exact scenario to see, does it make sense for you to be rolling a public CDN if that's the level that you need versus rolling your own? So you're saying you need all of this? This would be a public CDN.
Compared to like other CDNs that are out there, whether it's Akamai or Cloudflare, some of them provide such capability.
Gotcha. So this uses Akamai and Verizon under the hood. So you can either go direct or you can come through here. You're not rolling the Azure CDN is either Akamai or Verizon.
That's good to know then.
Okay. So that answers your question. If they're doing it, it's the same thing. You can either go directly through the Azure portal and have it set up, or you can go to Akamai and Verizon and set it up directly for some of those advanced services. I don't know how that plugs into the portal though. So otherwise, and then like I said, there's one other option, and I think it's if you're in China, it's a different CDN provider. Otherwise, it's these two. Gotcha. But so I hope that kind of answered your question, and the rest of that was really hard, and unfortunately, I don't know that answer. All right. Again, I will post these slides soon. These are all of the references. So if you want to know more, you can check these out. And if you want to know more about this or any other Azure thing, this is what it's going to look like when you're done doing your basic research. So I do a similar talk on Azure Service Bus, and I also talk about other messaging things like that. And you essentially end up with this. You go down a very long rabbit hole of many, many different links on the docs.microsoft.com when it comes to Azure. And you just read all of them repeatedly, and then you put together presentations like this as well as do your day job. So if you're wondering what it takes to stand up here and say this kind of stuff, a lot of this, and then so be aware of that. So saying that, if anybody wants to speak at the Philly Azure User Group, booking sessions for the fall. So there's that. Otherwise, they're all in there. And that's me, in case you were wondering. Come say hi afterwards, and thank you for joining. Any other questions from here or the internet? No? Check before I turn off my mic. All right, cool. You want to stop the recording? We'll be done.
Everybody for joining us.